In the United States, the voting system used for the vast majority of elections is the plurality system. The way it works is very simple. Every voter gets a ballot with each of the candidates' names, and they give their vote to whichever candidate they like the most. Whichever candidate ends up with the most votes wins. But this isn't the only way elections can work. There are many voting systems out there, but in this video we're going to focus on 3. Plurality, instant runoff, and a Condorcet system. Before we delve into how each of these voting systems works, it's helpful to construct an ideological space. This ideological space will be a two-dimensional plane that allows us to quantify how much each candidate is liked by every voter. If you want, you can think of this ideological space as the standard political compass, where the horizontal axis represents the economic left-right spectrum and the vertical axis represents the authoritarian libertarian spectrum. But it doesn't really matter what these axes represent specifically, as long as they are the two most important factors a voter considers when determining who to vote for. Now let's look at the fake town of Faketon. Faketon has 1,000 voters, and we can plot where each of these voters lies in the ideological space. You can think of this point as where their ideal candidate would be. There are 8 candidates vying to be the next mayor of Faketon: Alice, Bob, Carol, Dave, Eve, Frank, Grace, and Heidi. And each of these candidates has their own position within the ideological space. For the voters, how close any given candidate is to them determines how much they like that candidate. Voters like candidates that are close to them and dislike candidates that are far away from them. This particular voter is closest to Bob, so Bob is their favorite, and they are farthest away from Eve, so Eve is their least favorite. And we can do this calculation for wherever the voter is in the ideological space. Note that the candidate that is closest to them is always ranked the highest, and the candidate that is farthest away is always ranked the lowest. Now that we've defined an ideological space, we can begin to look at the different electoral systems to see how they differ. Let's start out with the good old plurality system, also known as first past the post. Again, the way it works is that every voter votes for their favorite candidate. I'm going to color each of the voters to correspond to the candidate that they like the most. Again, the candidate that is closest to them. In this situation, Grace would win because Grace has more votes than anybody else. Cool. Now, how would this election have played out if the candidates had different ideologies? Well, let's start to move the candidates around to different points in the ideological space. And as they move around, you can see their factions of voters grow and shrink depending on where they are in relation to each other. Notice that the candidates on the outskirts of the population tend to do worse than those in the center. This is because there are fewer voters on these fringes, so they're not able to gather as much support as those in the center. But this isn't always the case. When center candidates are too close together, this gives fringe candidates like Grace here an opportunity to thrive. This phenomenon is called the spoiler effect, and it's a common problem of the plurality system. So, all things considered, how well does the plurality system perform? Well, since this is a simulation, we actually know the true ideologies and preferences of every voter, something we can't know in the real world. So here, the ideal candidate is the candidate that has the least average distance to each of the voters. And if we keep running the simulation over and over again, we'll see that the plurality system elects the ideal candidate 41% of the time. Now let's look at the instant runoff voting system. Instant runoff voting is perhaps the most well-known alternative to the plurality system. Whereas under the plurality system, voters vote for one candidate, instant runoff voting uses a ranked choice ballot, where voters rank the candidates in order of preference. To determine the winner under instant runoff, you first look at the first choice votes on every ballot, just like in the plurality system. If any candidate has a majority of first choice votes, that candidate wins. If not, the candidate with the fewest first choice votes, Carol in this case, is eliminated, and all her votes are then transferred to whichever candidates Carol's voters ranked next. This process of eliminating the candidate with the fewest votes continues until a candidate receives a majority of votes. Just like with the plurality system, we can simulate how this election would have differed if the candidates had different ideologies. The winner of the instant runoff voting system will be shaped like a star, and the winner of the plurality system, if it differs from the instant runoff voting winner, will be a diamond. Whenever there's a disagreement between the two systems, you'll notice that the instant runoff winner is almost always closer to the center of the population than the plurality winner. This is because instant runoff is less susceptible to the spoiler effect than the plurality system. But the instant runoff system is not immune to the spoiler effect. There are still situations where the center is crowded and candidates who would have done well are eliminated early on. Here is a great example of that. The winner under instant runoff, Dave, would not have won if the final round was against Alice or Eve. But since they were both eliminated early on, Dave was able to pull ahead. So overall, how well does the instant runoff system perform? To put a number on it, we can again run the simulation over and over, and we'll find that it elects the ideal candidate 65% of the time. That's compared to 41% for plurality. So while it's definitely better, there's still much more room for improvement. Finally, let's talk about Condorcet systems. From the voter's perspective, the process is identical to instant runoff voting. All you have to do is rank the candidates in order of preference and you're done. To determine the winner under a Condorcet system, we start by determining who would win in a head-to-head election between every pair of candidates. For this election, let's start by looking at Alice and Bob. Since Alice is ranked higher than Bob on more ballots than Bob is ranked higher than Alice, we know that Alice would beat Bob in a head-to-head election if they were the only two candidates running. We signify this on the right with an orange connection between Alice and Bob. And now we'll do the same thing for Alice and Carol. In a head-to-head election between Alice and Carol, Alice would win, so we'll add an orange connection between the two to signify that Alice wins. Now between Alice and Dave, Dave would win, so we'll add a green connection between the two of them. And this process continues until we've looked at every pair of candidates. Now that we've constructed this graph, look at Dave. Dave has a very special property. Dave would win in a head-to-head election against every other candidate. In every election, there will be at most one candidate with this property, and in a small minority of elections, no candidate will have this property. When such a candidate does exist, they are called the Condorcet winner, and when they don't, this is because of the Condorcet paradox. Here's an example of an election in which the paradox occurs. These are the positions of Alice, Bob, and Carol. A majority of voters prefer Bob over Alice, Alice over Carol, and Carol over Bob, creating this cycle. It's very counterintuitive that this cycle can even exist in the first place, since you have competing majorities comprising different factions of the population, but it can happen. There are actually many different Condorcet systems, and each of them differs in how they handle the small minority of elections in which the Condorcet winner doesn't exist. For example, ranked pairs prioritizes the largest majorities, while the Condorcet Hare method uses instant runoff voting on the candidates that are stuck in the cycle. Given how rare the Condorcet paradoxes are, though, all of these systems essentially perform just as well as one another. Alright, now just like with the plurality and instant runoff voting systems, we can simulate how well Condorcet systems do when we move the candidates around. As they move around, you'll notice that the Condorcet winner is very stable at the center of the population. This is because the spoiler effect is almost entirely eliminated since we're looking at every possible pair of candidates. You'll also notice that the Condorcet winner is different from the plurality winner more often than not. So given all of this, how well do Condorcet systems perform? If we again simulate this election 1,000 times, we'll see that the Condorcet systems have an astonishing 98% accuracy, compared to 65% for instant runoff and 41% for plurality. This means that more than half the time, a Condorcet system will choose a better candidate than plurality. And given the enormous power that elected officials have, it's incredibly important to be choosing the correct candidate. There are more voting systems than I could possibly cover in one video, but I did run the simulation on a handful of other voting systems here if you're curious. And if this all still feels a little abstract, I created a straw polling website that allows for ranked choice voting. You can find it at strawpoll.vote or link in the description. Also in the description, you'll find a link to the GitHub repo I used for all the illustrations and simulations in this video.